Ayin Beis, Volume 1, Chapter 54, page 96. So, in the last chapter, we're in the middle of Discourse 14, I should add as well. Shoftim. In the last chapter, he began a discussion to understand the difference, or the uniqueness, or the quality of Ein Sof, of the Ratzon, of the Makif, the transcendent energy. He says, Tzarech lahav tchila inyan Ein Sof. We have to first understand what is Ein Sof. And he established, number one, Ein Sof means not Shel Ein Sof. We're not talking about an energy of something that has no end, but we're talking about the energy itself has no end. And he established that with two proofs. Number one, because if you're going to say that Eir is of Ein Sof, meaning of the source is much greater than Ein Sof. It's not just has no end, it has no beginning. Because there are things that have no end but have a beginning. You're talking about Atzmos, the source, you're going to call him Ein Sof, it's not an acceptable description. And he makes the case, it shows how there are things that can have a beginning but no end, either one of two ways. Either because it reflects the source, and therefore it has that quality of endlessness, meaning infinity, no limits, no parameters, which is Eir actually. Or because the desire, God's Ratzon, the will of God is to have something that is, He infuses something that on its own may not be permanent, to have a certain element of permanence. It's why Shamayim, he spoke about the celestial bodies that are individually, they are chazakim kiyem baram, they're strong like the day they were created. So within the period that they exist, they have that element of permanence. And in creatures on earth, after the chet etzadas, after the tree of knowledge, it's kayom b'min. Our endurance, our permanence is in the species. And he talks about that chet etzadas as well. Okay. So that's proof one. Proof number two is that Ein Sof, the expression itself, not just that God, Etzem, the essence, would be described, Ein Tchila is a more appropriate description if you're going to describe it already. Ein Sof suggests Ein Sof lis pashtuse, meaning when we say something is endless, it means it's in the category of being expressed. But this expression is endless expression. God, as he said, Etzem Einem Mispashet. And Etzem you can't even describe in the form of Ein Sof, like it's going on and on. It doesn't have to go anywhere. It is what it is. And Etzem is a reality as a reality. So for these two reasons, we cannot say Eir Ein Sof means Eir of Ein Sof. So it says Eir of the Etzem. And what is Ein Sof referring to? That the Eir itself is Ein Sof. Because it's Me'ain, it's similar to the source. As we explained, that it's not because, we just said God is not defined by Ein Sof. But a reflection of it is going to have a type of endlessness, because God has ability to be endless, obviously. It's just not a description, an apt description to define him that way. So something that reflects from him has that element of the Ein Sof. That's first point. And to understand this, he went into discussion, the second half of the chapter, of the difference between Ohr and Shefa. Energy, Ohr and Shefa are two forms of energy, or two forms of transmission. One is an Ohr, which we'll get to. To understand the Ohr, he went into the discussion of what Shefa is. So Shefa, he described the following. Shefa means that something is being transmitted, something of substance is being transmitted. And the point here, and they gave the examples of whether it's the hashpah of tzedakah, or in physical, the expression that used by Shefa Yamim, Shifas Mayim, the flow or the transmission of water. So these are actual substance of one thing being transmitted. And this substance creates a shinui in the source. Meaning that because something is giving it to another, it has to create a source. If it's water coming from a source, there's some effect in the source. Whether it's a shinu or it's a chsaron, but the bottom line is there's some change going on here. So in any type of hashpa, any type of transmission, you're having a change in the source. Okay. Same thing, keiches hanefesh. He gave the example for shefa and the faculties. The throwing a stone. So there is a change. You're investing your energy into causing the stone to throw. So you're both, from the perspective of the person who's the thrower, they have to invest that energy. While they're doing it, they can't do something else. It takes their strength. And it also creates a change in the personality, not in the actual personality of the stone, but in the state of being. It's now no longer resting on the ground. It's doing something opposite its nature. So there's an investment here. There's a involvement here. As we will see soon, Ohr requires no hisaskus, no involvement. Here there's an involvement. Involvement meaning some investment. You have to do something. And you have to do something that has substance. And what you're doing also requires an effort, basically. And then he explained the difference between Ilah v'Olol and Yesh Ma'ayin, cause and effect and Yesh Ma'ayin. So in Ilah v'Olol, he said there's a form of Ilah v'Olol where there's just an automatic flow from the cause to effect without this effort. He gave the example of Meichen and Midas on its highest level. It has that element. So you have cause and effect where you don't have that type of involvement, but Yesh Ma'ayin, in order to create something Yesh Ma'ayin, requires involvement because you're talking about doing something that is unnatural. Something that is not naturally flowing from one to the other requires an effort. So Yesh Ma'ayin is not a Mederach HaMelech thing, he says, not an automatic thing. So even though it's not quite like throwing it's not quite like extension of water, spreading of water flowing from one place to the other, because here it's a yesh and an ayin, as he explains. They're distant from one another, but it's also not an automatic process. And being that it's not an automatic process, let me just finish and you'll ask me. Being it's not automatic means there's a hislapshus. But he qualifies hislapshus means that the ayin has to in some way manifest in the yesh. There's nothing, the force, the so-called invisible force of creation has to do something to make the yesh. Just like when we throw a stone, you have to take the stone and throw it. So there's some connection, a relationship. The only thing is, he says, it's a relationship that is b'shalei be'erech. Because if it was be'erech, as he says, if the effect, meaning the result, the creation would be, then the creation would be similar to the source. So the bottom line is, he says that's in a form of, the expression he uses, it's in a form of einarech. So as opposed, for example, when you throw a stone, even though there is also a distance between you and the stone, as he says, but the distance here is far greater, but nevertheless there is a connection. But it's an invisible one. So the force that creates has a relationship and with the thing that it creates. And he said that's one of the wonders in Yesh Ma'ayin, that even though it manifests in the yesh, nevertheless it's in a way that is completely concealed, that the yesh does not know how it came to be. It feels like it's here, it doesn't know how it came to be in its feelings. So the same thing is when you throw a stone, it's concealed in the stone, the koyach, but there's a power there. Bottom line is, all this is an example of shefa. All this is an example where there's an investment of energy transmitted from one place to another. Yeah. That's the example he's giving. Yeah.
That's godly creation. How do you know there's an investment of energy?
You know, because you can't make a yesh and ayin automatically. God's light just extends without any additional effort. It won't turn into a yesh.
How do we know he just wills it happens? He doesn't deplete energy to do it.
Depleting is not the criteria for this. The criteria is whether you need to invest energy. The question that God doesn't get depleted, fine, because he's not human. But the fact is that if the Ohr and Shefa would just flow without any effort, without anything, it would never turn into a world. A world requires an investment, it requires an effort. Yeah, now there's Hashem flowing natural, would be Ohr and Shefa, without spheres, without anything. It would just be a flow of energy. without any definition or shape. As soon as there is, that means there's a hisaskus. What does it mean that God rested on Shabbos? The 6 days he didn't rest. It means that he went out of his own natural state and manifest in a Shabbos. He goes back to his natural state. It's not resting; he's tired. It's a question of anyway. That's
a great example.
Yeah. So he listen. The example he's using here, why he chose Yesh Ma'ayin, maybe we'll understand a little later, more details. Remember, he also described that there's two expressions. There's nivru, things that are created automatically. From Havaya, it is like b'derech memela, but from Elokim like manifests, like Mamala Kalam does manifest in the creation. In other words, Asar Mamoras Yehi Ohr, Yehi Rakia. So there is a level, he says, nivru, where you just say it came into being. But when you say Bereshis bara Elokim, it's an active effort that God brought. He's actively like a verb, not just a result of. So there is the level of, he said that as well, nivru. So that's not. So bottom line is, it's all this is okay. Then he concludes in this chapter that so all it's about relationships and transmission. So we're talking now about transmission of something of substance, which requires substance, which requires an investment, requires a commitment, requires an involvement. However, and therefore creates some shinui in the thing that is, some change in the transmitter. You keep going out of context here. He's using an example, Yesh Ma'ayin. The example is of Shefa. Shefa creates a shinui. When you take water from one place to another, when a teacher applies himself to a student.
You can't use Shefa for Shefa, right?
You could use. He's using it for Yesh Ma'ayin.
Why does it make a change in the Shefa?
Because it changes in Elokim. It makes a change. It affects. Because Elokim has to as soon as something has to invest in something.
As a manifestation.
We're not talking about Atzmus now. We're talking
as a manifestation. That nothing as a decrease. Okay.
You asked that question, but technically speaking, he's talking about Shefa. Shefa means some investment, and yes, an investment. There is something. In other words, it's not like the sun shining. The sun can give light, and it makes no difference to the sun whether the light shines doesn't shine. Here, there makes a difference on a level.
Change, but not a loss. Okay.
Well, a loss in the other levels of Shefa, yes. This I don't know. Maybe there is also. Maybe in Elokim there's also a loss. I'm not sure. You could say because it has to manifest energy in this place, it's not giving it elsewhere when you're talking that level. So there's very possible that there's also a diminishing. There's a tzimtzum in the air. Remember, that's called a diminishing. If God has to, if the Elokim, which is the lower level, Elokus, the spheres have to be diminished in order to go into containers, there's a diminishing. Don't call it a loss, call it a diminishing. There's something happening to them. Areas that go into Kalim are not oblivious. They're not just there, it makes no difference to them. They have to fit themselves into the container, just like the container has to fit itself to the air. I'm not talking about the word loss here. I'm going to start talking about that. But there is a shift, there is a change of situation. In other words, the energies in Bria are not like the energies in Atzilus, and the only difference is from our perspective. But bottom line is, see, now he goes to he says that Zrika, throwing something, is from the lowest of faculties. What means the lowest? Because if you compare throwing a stone to the personality of a human being, we have far many more things. This is only our movement. And it comes in something that's completely separate outside of us. Throwing a stone. Whereas, for example, he says the work of the art, the skill of art, of drawing, anything that has some intelligence, there already you see more of the manifestation. The point being here is that even when you throw a stone, there is a type of transmission that you're investing some energy in the stone, but it's not so obvious, and it's also very distant, very hidden. Whereas, for example, you see someone drawing a piece of a painting, there you can see the investment a lot more and more revealed, and he's more committed in a way. So you see more of him in there. When you throw a stone, you don't really see, as I said, who's throwing the stone. You see a piece of art, something that has artistic value, you can see that. And he gave the example, he said from the Magid, that we see sometimes in the effect, in the product, you can see the producer. Like the Magid was able to see that person. He says, and finally says that this distinction is, it comes down to how coarse and how subtle is the thing that you're creating. The more coarse it is, the less revelation and the less islapshus, the less manifestation. When something is more refined, more subtle, there's more revelation of the force, the creator that's producing, the producer that's producing that. Okay. And in spirituality, that means something that when, for example, in Atzilus, you're going to see more of revealed divine than in Bria or Yetzirah, because it's a more refined state. Therefore, it reveals more of the producer in it.
Maybe we should use the word simplicity and complexity.
On what?
When there's more, when the mashpia is more.
He uses the word dak and gas, which means literally more coarse, more refined, or more subtle. He doesn't use complex and simple. Obviously, if you see something that is requires more wisdom, like a piece of art or music or a book, so clearly because it's complexity, it's clear that someone really, someone, let's say, writes a line is much different than if you wrote a book. A line, you could say that too. But he doesn't really use the word complex. He uses more refinement or subtlety and coarseness. But it's all correct. It's all correct. It's all different forms of so-called transmission. But the point is, all of them go in the category of Shefa. That's what's been established, Shefa. So now we go to chapter Nun Dalet 54. And all this is to explain Ohr and Shefa, which all that is to explain Makif and Pnimi. Transcendent energy, and in contrast to immanent energy.
There seems to be also similarity between ideas. A koach makes a change, and it seems like mashpia is also mashpia.
Well, later we're going to learn about Ohr, Chayes, and Koyach, and they're going to make the comparisons. Right now it's Ohr and Shefa. Chassidus, there's discussions of Ohr, Chayes, and Koyach. The end of volume 1, there's the whole discussion between what's the difference between energy, Chayes, life force, and Koyach, a power, a faculty. Obviously, Ohr is always most connected, Chayes is less, and Koyach is even less. A faculty, like you said before, faculties of the soul, as opposed to, let's say, Rotzen HaNefesh. But we're not talking about that. There's going to be plenty of discussion on that matter. Right now, we're getting out into the world of Ohr and Shefa, which is okay. So now chapter 54. V'yuven zeyeser, and we'll understand this even more. Still in the middle of Shefa. Meaning his slapshus bekeches haruchnim. From the inyan of the slapshus manifestation keches haruchnim. I think I shall elaborate a little more on what his slapshus is. The best example for hashpah generally is a teacher and a student. He said many times earlier, teacher has to apply himself. Remember we said that both from the teacher has to apply himself and the student has to receive. What chapter was that in? Yeah, chapter 50. We talked about the training, ulfana, where there's a training, where desire doesn't take any time, but koiches take time. So hislapshus literally means when something dresses up in something else. But like when you dress up in the morning, it doesn't come automatically. You choose what garments, they have to fit you. It is a garment, it's not the essence of who you are, it's not your skeleton. But you're dressing and the garments are commensurate to the thing that is dressed in that garment. So hislapshus is a word used in Chassidus to explain when something is manifesting with a type of, if I could say, the Rebbe was in a state of hislapshus, means that he was involved, wasn't oblivious, was not aloof, was not distant. So when you say something is hislapshus, you mean that something is investing itself, it's immersing itself, it's committing to it. There's a that type of manifestation. So Shefa has that in a very real way, obviously. So now he's saying that now. So he explained it so far with examples of throwing something. He's explained. First he explained it with just simply like hashpah tzedakah when you give someone charity. Then he gave the example of water. Then he gave the example of throwing something, which is, in other words, he's moving along into like more subtle. Like when you like water flowing is a very physical example. Throwing something is already, what's the slapshas there? But you see, he's moving his way up, the Rebbe Rashab, because he wants to show that his slapshas, manifesting yourself, committing, is not just in a physical way. There's also in the faculties of the person throwing something. Then he went even further and said the same thing is Lamaila, the difference between El v'Ol and Yesh Mayim. So even above, he gave an example of that type of islapshus. So we have that islapshus. Now he's going and saying, to understand this even better, we can understand it even better from the islapshus of the Keiches HaRuchnim, the so-called ethereal faculties. Like in the manifestation, I use the word manifestation, islapshus of the seichel, intelligence, in the power of movement. Like when a person throws something, which is coming from the movement. Throwing means you take your hand, you grab an object, and you throw it. It's an example. He's using a simple, maybe the simplest possible example, because it just gives you an example in something that's not purely physical. Like we say, Shefa Yamim, okay, water flows from here to here, it's a hashpah. Or I pour you some water, that's Shefa. But he of course wants to bring this not into a physical type of transmission, he wants to explain it in a more spiritual sense, more conceptual sense. So the same idea is that when you take a stone and throw it, you are, in a sense, you are transmitting something. What is this transmission? So he says, Yesh b'zeh slapshus ha-seichel. You have some seichel there. There's some intelligence going on. You have to align yourself in your mind, umachshavta in your thought, eich lizrik, how to throw it. And that it should reach to the designated destination. You want to throw something, so it's not just random, it's applying yourself. That's another word, application, applying yourself to something. Which means that it should be a mechuvenes, an organized, not really organized, a mechuvenes. It should be a focused throwing. You're throwing it, how to throw it, as he says, and it should reach the right destination. So there's an intelligence here. Yes, as we said before, it's a minimal intelligence compared to theoretical thinking. But let's put it this way: without any type of intelligence, the throw will be a completely random or meaningless throw. We're not even talking about just recognizing it's a stone and so on. So there's some type of thought process that's going into this. Then he goes on a higher level. The same with the craft of drawing or art. For example, you have seichel there. There's intelligence. Now, these two comparisons and these two examples, you cannot compare how seichel manifests in drawing and how it manifests and applies itself into throwing. Being that throwing is the lowest power in movement, meaning, you're just throwing something. You're not throwing. Almost anybody can throw. You don't even have to train somebody. It does not have within it that much revealed seichel. Remember the beginning of the end of last chapter, which this is really just flowing from, is he said that the koyach hatzir, the koyach hatanua, the throwing is the lowest of faculties because it is the most so-called coarse activity. So it doesn't need
gases.
Right, gasus. So you don't have revealed in it, he said, ain't two things. It doesn't have revealed in it so much the power of the producer, of the source of the energy, and it's also not manifest, and also its manifestation is more concealed. So now he's saying here like this, same thing. In other words, before he was talking in general, just the relationship between the person who's throwing or the person who's drawing and the thing that they're and the activity or the production that they are producing. Now he's going and speaking about the seichel, how intelligence manifests in each of these, and this will explain it better. The idea of shefa will be understood more, and when we compare how much intelligence goes into throwing and how much intelligence goes into drawing, for example. So he says the first thing, being that is the lowest faculty within movement, throwing, it doesn't have so much as galus ha-seichel. It doesn't. You cannot say it has no seichel because, as he said, you have to know how to throw and to the place and the destination where you want it thrown. I don't think he's talking about a baseball pitcher because there is already an art there, and obviously, But nevertheless, even that, would you compare that, let's say, to an artist that knows how to draw a painting? So I'm not saying there isn't a skill. It's a different type of skill. But anyway. The eina behergish pnimi, and then the second thing that he said. Remember the two distinctions. One, that you don't have the revelation as much of seichel, and also you don't have. It's not that internalized. In movement, it's not such an internalized sensation and feeling. In other words, I think it's self-understood what he just said. So you're throwing, there's an intelligence there, but number one, it's not so much revelation of intelligence. Best proof is that, you can't, for example, the difference between a smart person throwing a stone and a not such a smart person is not going to be recognizable. And the second thing is, and the movement does not require a type of, like almost from the perspective of the mover, not the mover, of the hand that's doing the throwing, it's not such a hergish pnimi. And therefore, it's proving this now. Once he establishes a routine, he gets used to and establishes a habit how to throw, he doesn't even need to then think about it that much. He doesn't need lachavenis and lizrik. It becomes almost like a reflexive, automatic. Right. Exactly. But not completely. Yeah. It doesn't have to be mechaven. It doesn't have to align himself, focus how to throw. Even then, when he's doing it almost automatically, almost routinely would be the right word. Even there's some same seichel, but it's essentially concealed. It's fundamentally concealed. So there's a minimal amount of intelligence simply to make it happen, but it's fundamentally concealed.
You say the word the intelligence concealed, but the effects of it could be great. For example,
Yeah.
very used to painting real fast, and he could do a gorgeous thing.
Well, let's talk about throwing now, because he's going to go to art. Yeah, no, we're not talking about the product being great.
That's not a great baseball player who does it so often, you see it as great. So the observer doesn't...
He's talking now the seichel that is that's required to be invested in it. Let's put it this way.
I understand.
Like in other words, you can almost do it in the sleep.
But a minute ago, you were just mentioning the proof of the results. The results you always can't tell how much the seichel invests in it by what an observer sees as a result. For example, a guy who's investing in learning something, you can't tell whether he accomplished anything, even though he accomplished profound things, because there's nothing that necessarily shows to the observer. But sometimes the guy struggles with this and that, and he gets nothing, and he doesn't accomplish anything. The guy who watches him thinks he accomplished a lot. So you just never know.
Fine, but regardless, the point here is that what he's trying to do is explain the different levels of application and how much of the producer is invested in what he's producing. So we established that there is some investment, even in the lowest form of, which is just a plain throw. A plain throw is like almost the most menial type of action that a person will do, right? Because he's throwing a stone.
Or passively listening to a radio is like a minimal thing usually.
But he's not using that example for a reason, because he wants to produce something. He doesn't want a passive. He wants an aggressive an act. Because it's important here that there be an act in this shefa. Because shefa means some form of transmission.
Just minimal act.
Okay, but this is the example he's using. So there in the minimal form of it, which is of course minimal, there is some seichel. Once you train yourself, the seichel becomes even more concealed. But like he says, but there's still something there. Fine. Now he's going in a more invested, a more applied, in the skill of the craft of drawing, of artistry, yesh b'zei slapshus v'izgal seichel yeser. There you have more manifestation and more revelation of seichel. And also on the second end, and it's also more hergish primi. You feel it more internalized. You feel it more. It's felt more. Whereas, as I said, like by the stone, it's not. By the throwing of the stone. It's like, let me just... No, I don't think it's necessarily the observer. It could be in the act itself. It's felt. I don't know if he's talking about an observer necessarily. Also the end product maybe. One second. I want to just see something in his Galus Bazekal Kach. Niful Dover Gas in his Galus Bazekal Kach. It could be both. Like he said before, the Magid was able to see in a vessel, in a product, he was able to see the personality, the type of person who produced it. And he said that's more possible than by throwing something, because there's more revealed connection between the producer and the product. So there he was talking about the observer, but here I think it's also in the actual act itself. The actual act itself, number one, as he said, it's more revealed the seichel, and it's also in a more internalized way. That's by tzir. And every time you draw something, every time you need to have an applied intelligence. More, in other words, even that you mentioned, even if the artist is now a master and has learned the routine, he makes two different paintings. It's not the equivalent of someone who's just routinely throwing a stone and just learned, could almost do it reflexively. So relatively speaking, of course, an expert is going to look like less effort. But the fact is, I'm a writer. I've been writing for 30 years. Every article is the same struggle like the first I've ever written.
Really?
Yes. Same difficulty. The only thing is I know I can do it, and I know the skills to do it. But the frustration, for example, involved in getting the idea clear. Nothing changed. And I remember someone telling this to me 30 years ago. And I also have expressions now, but sometimes I can sit now and 8 hours and nothing will come out. Because it's not working. Either that or because it's not so clear. The bottom line is there's an effort, there's no question about it. Anyone that has effortless art that's coming effortless, I doubt that it's.
I was thinking.
I'm not talking about. I'm not talking about tricking it, where I take the same article and I just.
These Chinese artists they do 9 brush strokes, gorgeous paintings, and I knew this woman. And she took it to
I didn't say again. You're talking exceptions.
30 seconds. Boom.
First of all, we're not talking about the amount of time. So they know how to apply themselves quickly. That's number one. Firstly, you give me examples, but take the biggest artists. You're telling me that they put the same effort, the less effort in Rembrandt, 2 different Rembrandts. Hours of work in each one of them. Every author. It's not because they're not capable. It's because they want to invest. They're conveying a new message. If that's the case, why would the Rabbi sweat every time they spoke? It's automatic. They'll just say Torah because it's a real investment. My point is, we're not talking now how good you are. Obviously, someone like us who's not trained to do something is going to take us far, and we won't even get there. Someone who's trained just has the technique. I have certain tricks of the trade, technique. But every Farbrengen listening to Farbrengen didn't make it easier. I just knew how to do it. I had the confidence. It's like running a marathon. You tell me a runner who's run a marathon and won, the next time he's going to have to condition himself, and he's going to have to drink, and he's going to have to run with the same energy. The only thing is he has the confidence that he can do it, which is a major source of success. The point of the matter is, however you twist and turn it, he says here, there's every time you need to have islapshus haseichel. V'adugma l'mayla. Okay, fine. So now what we've established here that is added here to the picture is, before he was just talking about you throw something, you draw something. So clearly one is more applied than the other. Here he brought the seichel into the picture, just to make it a little clearer. He said, "V'yuven ze yeser." So now he's going, after concluding, remember this Hemshech was written without chapters initially. So the V'yuven Zeyesa was a direct flow from the previous chapter. So I would say now he's going now to above. I think he's finished the mushals, he's finished the examples, Mishalim, and he's now moving to how it is his source. So let's see, and often when we see the Nimshal, how he explains it, we'll understand why he used these examples and all the details of it. The example for this above is Kideisa b'Sefer HaBoyer, like it says in Sefer HaBoyer. Sefer HaBoyer is one of the original texts, Kabbalistic texts. Aryeh Kaplan actually wrote a good translation of it, and it's equivalent. It's a similar time like the Zohar, and actually means similar word. Boher means illuminating. Zohar means splendor. Also, Boher means behirus. So it comes from that word. A lot of the Kabbalistic works have the word Ohr in it. Boher, Zohar, Zohar.
Akana wrote that one too.
Yeah. They say Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana. Yeah. He writes in his introduction, Kaplan, the different opinions. But it's a book quoted in Chassidus in many places. One of the classics from Sefer HaBoyer is the one about Avram Avinu. That after Avram was born, Chesed of Atzilus said to Hashem, "What do you need me for?" And he's doing the job. But Sefer HaBoyer has different places in Chassidus. So what does it say there? He took Tzereres is
Stones, or clods of dirt.
Tzereres are particles, really. Or maybe Tzereres from the word sur. I think Tzereres means like what's the word I want to use?
Little bundles.
Not Tzereres is sometimes also like rags. I have to look up the exact translation. Not Tzereres. He took pieces, he took particles, he took maybe even stone, the pebbles or something like that. But I think Tzereres sometimes means like when you tear up, let's say, a garment and you have like shreds, like pieces. I think Tzereres is also from the word pieces. V'zarkan, he threw them, and from them became earth. V'yedua, it's known that this is the Koach HaGvul. What does it mean? It's obviously a mashal. This is the Koach HaGvul. This is the power of the defined within Ein Sof. That manifests, applies itself, slapshus, not makiv. Manifests within Elemis, within the world. Rakshahu behelam. Only thing is, it's concealed. And I think I need to add this again. When God created the universe, and we've talked about this in many places in Chassidus, there's Shevav Kalaman and there's Mamala Kalaman. Shevav Kalaman is the desire to create. It's an energy that's necessary. Without that, you don't have existence. It will bring the yesh into being. But God didn't want to just create from a distance. He wanted actually to have specifics. So he said, Yehi Ohr, which is an application. He said the word Ohr. Let there be light. Let there be a rakia, a firmament. Hidesha, let there be vegetation. Vahima Eris, let there be celestial bodies. These are all specific words that have specific function. This is rooted in the Koach HaGvul. Very similar to what we discussed earlier about Eser Sfiras HaGnuzes, but there I think he's talking about Ohr. This may be the Kalim, Rishimu. But regardless, it is specific. So God manifested himself. So we don't have a relationship just with God's will that he wants a world. There's also a connection to the Ohr in the world, to the Rakia in the world. That's why he says in Shayach Vamuna, everything, every second is renewed anew from the 10 Maimoros. He said, what about, there's only 10 expressions. But they break down to the letters of Hebrew have Tzirufim, different combinations, Gematrias, Chilufim, Tmuras. How these letters? So even the word Even, for example, Even, you're not going to find in the Torah that God said, let there be a stone. But Even is a subcategory of one of the 10 Maimoros. Just like the 10 spheres, we have more than 10 objects in the universe. But they're all made up of the same DNA, the same 10 building blocks. It's just different configurations. So we have those configurations as a divine energy that's very much tailored and defined by existence, to fit into existence. So this is called hislapshus. So it's exactly what I said before. 6 days God created the world, then the 7th day He rested. But he was tired? No. 6 days He manifested Himself in a very specific structure that He wanted to have. And Shabbos, He goes back to His more so-called, if you want to call it natural place, I don't call it natural place, but not that particular investment in it right now. So the same thing we do. 6 days we're immersed in the structure of existence, and on Shabbos, we go back to the so-called more, the Bligvul, if you want to, the Ohr.
Even on Shabbos is recreating the world every second.
So that's from the Chitzenius and so on, but it's not with the same. It's also what the focus is. There it's being, it's like almost that's maybe the routine. That's He's doing it by routine. 6 days it's within a more of a, and the Gemara Chagiga it says. What's saying Chagiga? Basar dvarim bara Kodesh Baruch Hu. With 10 things, God created the world. B'chochma, b'tfunu, b'daz, b'keich, b'garo. With wisdom, with tfunas bina, with understanding, b'das, with knowledge, b'keich, with power. B'garo means like gear, like almost incitement. What? Gara, sculpting? I don't think so. Gara sounds to me more intensity. I'm not sure. The 10 things are all, in a way, they come into his slapshus, manifest. And there are many different levels within the creatures. Even though the general creation coming into being is from these 10 things, nevertheless there are creatures, their primary life source is Chabad, Chochmah Bina Das, the first 3 things. And there are those that their primary B'chinas Hamidus. Yeah, Keich Gaira is more like intensity. Sometimes, like, that's what I think it means. Maybe not. Maybe you're right. Maybe sculpting, I'd have to look it up. I'm going to look it up. Gaira sometimes means, Giyur means, no, that's a different word. I was thinking of more like, not when you shout at someone, but when you scold. It's like provoke in a way. I'll look it up. So when it says in the Gemara that 10 things, it means in general everything comes from that. But there's differences where some creatures primarily get from Chachma Bina Das, from the first 3, Chachma, Tfuna, and Das, and from Midas, which is Keich and Gaira. And according to this, meaning according to the way what they relate to is the difference in how much the Slapshus and Tfisa happens. How much manifestation and Tfisa and containment is taking place. Remember, he's using this now to explain. We just spoke about the difference, for example, throwing something and the skill, the craft of artistry, of art. So he's giving now example. He's applying that now how it's Lamaila. Lamaila also the same thing. Everything was created with these 10 things. But there's a different level of involvement and commitment depending on what it is. Like, for example, Chabad is clearly those creations, those creatures that Chabad is their primary source, have more of a commitment from Chabad there, like art. The creatures in the universe that are more from Midas have a different type of commitment. That's what he's saying. Ifin Kazeh, meaning based on their particular function. One relating more to Chabad, one relating more to Midas. He didn't give any examples yet. That will make the distinction between how much energy of the divine energy is manifesting. So let's say the areas of life, I'm just giving an example, the areas of life that are connected, let's say science. For example, the wisdom of Chochmah Satchuna, the Chochmah of astrology. So God created the celestial bodies, meaning the sun, the moon, the earth, the planets, the solar systems, and so on, with a wisdom. there's no question that is like art. So there you have a manifestation of the divine energy that manifests. We're talking about the one that manifests, the slapshus, of the same equivalent of like how much an artist invests in making a piece of art. Then there are things God created, let's say for argument's sake, I want to be careful because I don't want to say a stone. A stone has equally wisdom. If you think of a stone and you dissect it, it's full of subatomic particles. But for argument's sake, let's just say a stone simply because on an obvious level it doesn't have the magnificence of, let's say, a sunset or the seas and the solar system. Just to say a plain stone. So there it's less revealed. Not that there isn't in it the wisdom, but he's basically saying there's a difference. In other words, the revelation is both from the perspective of the producer, or the poel means the one who's causing the effect, and in the effect itself, in the object of the effect. Like we spoke before, the two differences. That's why I was careful not to say the observer, because I think he really means not the observer. He really means from the perspective of the one that's doing it. So the one that throws, like he said at the bottom of page 95, remember he said that God, two things. That he has Zerik, Nitfiz Bazrika, the one who throws. He said, you need a manifestation both from the one who throws and from the thing that's being thrown. The thrower has to apply himself and to throw it. And it won't happen on its own. And when he throws it, he can't do something else. So he's invested. He's somewhat applied to himself. And also, and also the effect that it has on the stone, it's also islapshus because it's doing something to the stone that wasn't done before. So, for example, if you looked at a stone and just looked at it, observing it would take effort because you're studying it. But the stone, there's no effort on the stone's part because the stone is just is a passive object that you're watching. But you want to throw a stone, the process of throwing the stone itself, not that the stone is involved in the throwing, but the stone itself, there's a type of islapshus going on because something's happening to it. Meaning there's something happening to it. It's not just a passive situation. So now he's applying the same two things here. So and the differences in relationship between creations and their creative force depends on what they are. There's a difference of how much islapshus there is from the perspective of the poel, the one who's causing it, and from the perspective of what's being caused.
The object.
Right. And it's explained elsewhere an example on this. Example for this, like someone who commands another person, who orders another person, or mitzvah means yes, he instructs another person to do something. How does he instruct him? It's with the voice and with words. He says something to him. He gives him a command. Or when a person speaks words of love or words of intelligence. That too is with a voice and words. And speech. Voice and speech. And they're not similar at all one to another. In a command or an order, the mashpia, the transmitter, the one who's doing the ordering, is not applied himself with his faculties as much. And also the recipient, the one who's hearing the order, is not committing and applying himself that much, only to hear the command. It's basically like he said a little earlier with Ratzin, it's like an order. So you have an authority ordering you to do something, or commanding you, or instructing you. Both the one who's commanding and the one who's listening, both are not completely, don't have to apply all their faculties there. However, the person speaks loving words. The one who's communicating, the transmitter of these words, is applied, is committed, is nitfus b'zeh, is invested, is more involved in it with his feelings that come in a revealed way, because he's speaking love. Love requires more of you, so to speak. The other thing is more of an order. Not to say that there isn't a process and there's a reason he's ordering, but the investment is different, which is when you really love somebody or when they're upset at you, you spend time. You get that?
And if you're a general commanding the legions and you have an involved plan or football.
So you don't understand the distinction? You're saying that
No,
it's the same
I don't-
thing?
I don't-
In other words, when you say one person speaking to their
Doesn't have to
beloved,
be
someone's
that
just
way.
speaking to a beloved, you don't see the difference between someone who's giving a command?
It's not always like that. That's
Again, so who says always? It's an example or not an example? He's giving an example.
the example.
You're looking for an exception?
Oh, okay.
Everyone would understand that someone who's speaking with their beloved one is more in it than an order or the person listening. The bottom line is, it's not a question of intention. The question is how much of energy he has to invest. To give a command, as he said, the word that the Rebbe Rashab says, these are the exact words.
Getting a cup of coffee is like a very easy command.
Okay, exactly. Eina mashpia nitvis
Love you, honey.
He says, Eina mashpia nitvis b'keichesav kol kach b'zeh. The transmitter is not invested with his faculties. Doesn't mean he doesn't care about his command. He does not have to invest and apply his faculties as much as someone who wants to convey love. It's very, very clear difference. We're talking about a very functional difference. We're not talking about the importance of the command. If he says, go out there and win the war, we're talking about the investment of the person's emotions and feelings in it. You don't see a distinction? Can you give me an example of a distinction, or everything is equal to you? Every time two people communicate, it's always equal to you?
No, but you can,
I'm asking you a question.
you can very, very easily say, love you, honey, and walk out.
And that's not love. That's not love. That's what he'll say. That's mechanical. And you know something, you won't say that if the person you love is upset at you. Because then it's really dismissive. So can you give me an example of two types of communication where one there's more investment and one there's less, or for you it's all equal? I'm asking you a question.
But I think it could be an
I just asked you, is there such a distinction?
Sure, but it's not.
What do you mean but? Why is there a but?
I
Why?
don't think it's in the type of things. I think in any type of a situation, sometimes you can be more invested than others.
So whatever example, this example works completely. I understand this example. You don't like this example, it's fine. But you understand that there's a situation where there can be.
Right.
So you find an example works for you. This example the Rebbe Rashab is giving, I see it being an excellent thing. I think it's maybe the best example possible, because there's no better example than committing to someone that you love. There are people who speak, for example, you speak to a stranger, and they say, you give me a cup of coffee, you give them a cup of coffee. Can you compare that to a person who loves someone and is spending hours and hours talking to the person they love? Okay, it's not even the same quality. That's a major distinction. You give me a scenario where a person who loves someone is being mechanical and not really expressing love, then you're talking about a person who's not really invested. Maybe they're not so loving. Who knows? He's not talking about here, he's talking about the act. There's two acts here. One person is giving a command, an order. His faculties are not necessarily so invested in it. They're not invested in it in that way. Most importantly, involvement in it. A simple example would be, if you're speaking to someone you love in a loving way, we're not talking about some mechanical by rote thing, the way one who loves somebody should speak to someone they love. You can't be doing anything else at that time. You can't be texting. You can't be doing anything else. If you do it, it's a compromise of your communication. Whereas if you're giving an order, bring me a coffee, you can do 1,000 things afterwards. First of all, it's not an insult. Secondly, you can move right on to something else. You give me an example, a command of a general when the whole war is at stake. Yeah, you gave me one scenario, but there are many commands that I just said. Like I said, bring me a coffee. Whereas if it's a loving communication, it's a whole different type of involvement and application. That's what he's basically saying. Remember, when it comes to examples anywhere, especially in Chassidus, every example is exactly that. It's an example. Your question, you can ask a question. You could say this example doesn't work. But to say there's an exception to the example, every example that you can destroy. Richard Feynman, when he gave examples, 1 second. Because it's not. Because generally speaking, a command, he says, he's giving a scenario. He says, generally a command does not require that type of event. If it requires more, that's the exception. Richard Feynman, when he would give these brilliant examples for quantum mechanics, he would give examples, and he would always say, and I know that people are going to say, well, he says, that's why it's an example. It's not the original. An example, by definition, means that he's not going to find we give all these examples for and then we say, but it's not like that. even though some aspects is.
Doesn't exactly reflect the niche.
Here I wouldn't say it in those words. Here I just said you gave me an exception. But generally speaking, the command of asking someone to give you a coffee, or someone speaking beloved, is a pretty strong example. You don't need a lot. You don't need to force it in any way. It's not like some rare situation. It's two different completely. That's what I said. Find me. We're constantly involved in this type of situations, where there are places where, as I said, hislapshus, and then there is where a person is more aloof, if you want to put it that way. I mean, he doesn't use that word here. Anyway, divrei avi divrei sechel. Yeah, when I spoke the other day about the difference between a yoyitz, an advisor, a friend, and a rav, teacher. You come to a rav, he may give you 5 minutes. This is the ruling. Goodbye. A yoyitz will speak to you. Will get and commit. Want to hear your situation. Want to hear all the things before he gives advice. You know, a rav may need to hear more details, but there's not the same type of immersion. No, 100% not. And especially if he's completely commanding, if he's just telling you this is the way it is, he calls you in and says, go, you have to do that and that. Now, if he wants you to understand it, he'll explain it to you. But let's say a teacher who applies himself. How could you compare that to someone who is commanding someone, or someone who's just, a teacher just says to the student, bring me the book, bring me a sefer. Okay. Anyway, and the same thing's from the perspective of the recipient. What time do we have here?
2 minutes before 10.
Same thing from the perspective of the recipient. That the he's more committed within it by hergishabai, with his feelings. Because he feels the power of his mashpia, of the one who's conveying, and becomes closer to him through this. So when someone speaks with love to someone, they love. The one who's receiving the words is also more involved, because he's feeling the closeness and he feels the kind of care, and he gets closer through it. Whereas in an order or command, you maybe have a lot of simcha for following God's command, but you can't say that there's a hergish primi there, because there was no immersion. This is what you're supposed to do, so I go do it.
Torah's even a lot of emotion. You spend a whole lifetime trying to do that.
Yeah, but you also have the second half. That Torah wants us to have both elements: the Kabbalah soul of listening, and then also making a feeling for it. And even more so, it's in the transmission of intelligence. Even more than love, he's saying that both the teacher and the student have to both apply themselves more. More manifestation, more application, and more revelation. And everything comes through speaking, through voice and speech. That's why when you command someone, it's with a loud voice. His garbus hakel, an overpowering voice. But when you speak seichel, when you're teaching something, you don't need to have a loud voice. On the contrary, the words of the wise are said very gently. Because there, by command, the main thing is the kale, is the voice. It's the bark. It's the intensity. When he's transmitting seichel, it's not so much the voice, it's the words. The primi, because you're transmitting intelligence. Now this is all an example. Now he's going back. The same things with the 10 things with which God created the world. As soon as you say God created the world with 10 things, you're talking about how He manifested in it. We're not talking about how He's beyond it. And there are distinctions in the creatures, as he said before. From which level is their primary source? Their primary source and their source of being. So according to this, is the hislapshus, the manifestation and the revelation in relationship between the creator and the creature. Okay. So all this was coming to explain the difference between throwing something and applying yourself into, let's say, art. that there's a difference in how much you apply yourself. Now he goes on. Even what we just all said, this is all tenuah. This is all the movement. Whether it's a movement of throwing a stone or it's the movement of using your fingers to draw a painting. Or lamaila, the difference between creating something so-called like commanding it or ordering it to do it. Let's say like when you throw a stone, it's more like an order. Or when you're drawing something, which is more application and more investment. That would be like the comparison. The same thing we'll understand in the transmission of intelligence from a mashpia, from a teacher to a recipient, from a transmitter to a recipient. That also the muhus ha-seichel, not just the power of throwing, the muhus ha-seichel itself, nishpa b'zeh, is transmitted through this, in this. And that seichel is also his lapshus. So he's right now adding, not only, in other words, have you invested your power to throw or your power to draw, you're also bringing seichel into it. Even though the general transmission of intelligence is only a reflection, is like it's known the difference between when you transmit intelligence and you transmit something that's essential. For example, the Tanya, when he brings the Tanya, something essential is when you, let's say, the seed that's transmitted in order to conceive of a child. So you're not just transmitting a reflection. Seichel, the seichel is your intelligence, and you're giving a reflection of your intelligence. You're not transmitting something essential. You're not giving that person life, for example. You're giving them intelligence. You're giving them ohr. The bashpa atzmi se'etzem mamish nishpa. In a transmission that's an essential transmission, the essence itself is transmitted b'zeh. Sharinas mizem b'hus seichel mamish eitzel haben. So when the father, like it says in chapter 2 of Tanya, that the zera ha'av, the seed of the father, then fertilizes an egg, and that a child is born, that child has seichel, didn't just get from a teacher toward the child seichel, it's a seichel that comes, the brain itself, the mind itself comes, the mind comes from the parent. Eitzel haben. Mashing b'shpos ha-seichel is teaching seichel. You're not giving them seichel. You're not giving them brain and mind. The mind is not being given by a teacher. Intelligence is being given. With a child, the child has nothing on its own. The seed and the egg fertilized become conceive a child. Now a child has a mind and a heart and so on. By a student, the student already has seichel on his own. The teacher is what a teacher is doing, is adding intelligence or cultivating it. So he receives this intelligence from the teacher and he learns through it. He's trained and educated through it. But if he was not a bar seichel on his own, if he had no seichel on his own, if he was not a person of seichel, if he didn't have a mind of his own, the teacher can teach all day and all night and it won't help. It won't emerge any seichel. Any personality of intelligence through this. Like the world says, you can't place a head on somebody. It's a Yiddish expression. Either you have a head or you don't have a head. A teacher can't give you the head. They can give you what to fill your head with. Because intelligence is only a reflection. This is all a question. He's trying to say that seichel is invested in the thing that it is teaching or producing. So he said, but isn't it only a reflection? Yes, compared to etzem, they just said, like the seed, that's a reflection. But kol mokim, nevertheless, it's not just a reflection like the reflection of the sun that's oblivious. Here, the personality of the seichel, of the reflection, is being transmitted within this. He's transmitting him real seichel, the essence of seichel. He's not transmitting him essence, meaning the mind, the brain, but he's giving him seichel. And it's coming from the essential seichel, the intelligence of the Rav. It's not some byproduct. It's coming from his mind. And the student receives within this intelligence from the Rav. It's not some incidental or peripheral product it is the intelligence. So therefore, v'zehu sha'ashpa he would be kiyuma gam lachad hefsek hashpa, and that is also the reason that the transmission remains intact and is preserved. It's what I want to say, not endures. Kiyuma. No, it what did you say? Remains, but I want to say it endures. It endures gam la'achri hefsek hashpa, even when he stops transmitting. V'gam la'achri siluk hamashpia mipnei, and also after when the teacher leaves, when he's not there anymore. Mipnei shemachus ha'ora nimshach b'zeh, because the essence of the reflection was transmitted here. When the sun leaves, there's no more sunlight. When the teacher leaves, and even when he's still there, when the idea stops, even when the idea stops flowing, and the teacher, and it goes even further, even the teacher leaves, the idea is still there. You have it now. It's yours. So something was transmitted here. It's just not etzem like a father transmits seed and the conception of a child, but there is a real hashpah going on here. Al kain gam afila acher shemistalik hamashpia yochel ayin ba. That's why even after the mashpia leaves, he could still immerse himself in it. The student to limtze bezeh hachayis, and he can find within it life and energy. He can find it the same life and energy and excitement. Right. At the time, he could find within it the same energy, the same life, the same vitality as he had when he received the transmission from the transmitter. Right. Which, as I said, is not like Ohr Hashemesh. The Be'oir, because by light, real light, when the essence is gone, also the reflection is gone, is removed. But when the transmission of intelligence, the transmission remains. That's Shefa. That's the key difference between Shefa and Ohr. Because the mechus of the ha'ara, not just reflection, something essential in the reflection remained. Not the essence, but the essence of the reflection. And that's why that's why, this is the explanation why he has to invest in it. The sun does not have to invest in giving light, because the light doesn't remain. All it is a byproduct. It's all incidental byproduct. It's automatic. Like we spoke before, mamela. It's coming mamela. His slapshus means when you have to manifest yourself in it, because you have to give something over. You have to give something over more, you have to manifest more. If what you're giving is less manifestation, less application, less commitment. So you could say an order is less commitment in a way. And I wouldn't use that word exactly, actually. That's why the way you transmit is in a form of you have to invest in it. The mashpia is committed, contained by it, is involved in it, is confined in it, you can even say. And it causes within him a shinoi v'hispilus, a change and a spilus, some type of reaction, some excitement, some reaction. This answers what you asked. Remember, you said when it comes to water, when water transmits, there's less water in the source. When you transmit seichel, there's not less. So he's now answering that. He's saying it's not less, but it definitely changes you. He's saying, first of all, you're investing. Second, now he's saying it adds to you. So there, it adds instead of diminishing. So he says, so bottom line is that there's a shinui. But
Shefa can add to you.
Exactly. It goes both ways. Wow. Some light doesn't subtract, but it doesn't add to the sun. Yeah.
So it's not necessarily.
There's a relationship. There's a relationship. Remember we spoke about koiches and rotzen. Rotzen has no relationship with it just commands, it tells you what to do, desire. Koiches is a relationship. As soon as there's a relationship, it's a two. Because through the transmission, something is increased, intelligence within the transmitter. Like we say, from my students, I learn most.
Okay. That's cool.
Besides the fact,
It's not going to make you wealthy.
yeah. Now he's saying like this. Besides the fact, besides that fact, there's a student that sharpens the mind of his teacher. They have kushes through questions, and so on, which is why questions are acceptable here. Okay. So in addition to the fact that the student actively inspires and sharpens the mind of the teacher through questions and so on, the mere thing that you're transmitting to another adds. So Tamid Yesem Kulam is more than just, in other words, when you say, I learned much, he said, I learned much from my teachers, even more from my colleagues, but the most of all from my students. He doesn't mean because my students ask me questions. He's saying the mere fact that I had to explain it to the students and bring it to them, that alone added. So the hashpah itself, it's not because even the student, in addition, of course, the students' questions. Here goes now, you're going to like this one even more. V'chein heder hashpah. And also when he refrains from transmitting, that weakens the teacher and the mashpia. He's weakened. He causes a deficiency in him. Something's missing. And now he adds a parenthesis to qualify that. V'hainu, that means that's when he's also not transmitting to himself as well. Then really, when you're talking about transmitting seichel, you don't need another. You can also sit and conceive of ideas by yourself. And then he won't have that diminishment. He won't have that lack. But on the other hand, to add, primarily it's through another. What he's saying here is that both are necessary. That another adds to you, and you're not giving to another diminishes. But not giving, you could say the diminishing is you can still exert yourself and struggle yourself, so you must be it to yourself. So there, at least, there's no diminishing. But the primary addition is only through another. In other words, by sitting and conceiving on your own, you don't have what a talent can give you. You may not have the loss that losing something. In other words, you don't lose as much, but you don't gain as much.
Bina is Shefa.
Relatively to Chochmah, within yourself, the Bina within yourself.
Right.
But there's the Mashpiyah to the Mekabel, right? V'hu mugder b'hashpa, another thing. Another explanation of Shefa, another element of it, is that it's mugder b'hashpa. It's defined, it's confined. Mugder means that it's confined by it. That the transmission is confining you, the transmitter. Because while he's transmitting, he's unable to conceive of another seichel, of another idea. Like he said before about the stone, you can't be involved in another thing when you're throwing. And he's also mutrid, he's busy with it. He's mutrid, he's involved in it. Mutrid is like tirda. It's almost like a, I won't say tirda saparnosa means the pressures. He's pressured by the hashpah. He's involved in it. Because the transmission is not going to happen on its own. He needs to transmit the seichel. And this struggle, this tirda, this effort, this tirda, this work, this hard work, this exertion, is also how to transmit. That's the kloyes, which means the intelligent kidneys, the advisory kidneys. How to transmit. The liyash, like in Tanya, in Ager's case, she says Yesod is when the teacher bonds with the student. So he has to think. Netzachayid rather is how he conceives of how to connect, how to bond, and how to communicate. And then there's Yesod is the bonding process itself. So this too requires an investment. The liyash in hashpa, eina b'bchinas gili ha'etzem, being that transmission like shefa, that's hashpa, is not gili ha'etzem. What we spoke earlier, just revealing the essence, which is just to reveal the essence, the source. Rather, it's in order to affect something by the recipient. Therefore, you need to have the strategy within this, how to transmit. In the way that it should be received by the recipient. So there you can go. That there are people who are like Ohr, There's no way for them miskabel. They just, even if it's true, even if it's good Ohr. And there are others who give it to you in a Shefa way. That it can be absorbed by the recipient. Shazau hefers ben malamed bar poel le'ina bar poel.
They should teach this paragraph in every teaching school.
Absolutely. Shazau hefers, this is the difference between malamed bar poel le'ina bar poel. Malamed bar poel is someone that is an action oriented. The bar poel means someone that brings things into action. A malamed, a teacher who brings things into action, to someone who's not action oriented. Even though he can be a very big bal seichel, he's a big intelligent person. Bal seichel gadol yeser. The second one can be the one who's not an implementer. Can be someone who's a greater mind than the first one. He's not a bar poel. Means a person who, an action man, a man who brings things into action. He's asking a question. Malam bar poel is an expression. It's an expression of the Gemara, I believe. Well, it may even be a pasuk. No, it's not a pasuk. But Malam is a teacher with bar poel. He says limud, seemingly limud teaching is totally in seichel hasaga. It's dependent on intelligence and comprehension. U'misha hu bar seichel gadol b'yichalta l'lamed yeser. And the person who's a greater, more intelligent person should have more capability to teach. Like we can see, when a student grows and matures and grows older, he needs a better, greater teacher. The person who taught him psukim, chumash, the pasuk, and he could not teach him mishnah, for Gemara, etc. So we see as a person grows, they need a more bar seichel, they need someone who's more intelligent and more. So why is he talking here about bar poel, about bringing it into action? You should just talk about who cares if he's smarter. He's the better teacher. He says no. Makol mokim. Nevertheless, in order to affect the student, if you talk about pure brain power, the first one has more. But if you talk about affecting the student, he should be influenced by it, impacted, absorbed. This is by someone who's a bar poel, someone who understands and applies himself to the action of bar poel. Someone who cares, in other words, knows how to strategize about each student exactly. He's able to organize his words.
Seems to be implying giving a content to his.
L'chalkel dvarav. L'chalkel, no, he knows how to not organize. L'chalkel to coordinate and to it's like a person has a lot of ideas. They know how to put it in the right. Organize. I'll say in a second, but it's organized. It's coordinate, consolidate. To consolidate, and to organize the ideas in a way that they should be understood and received by the recipient. And he also has to conceive of, he has to also be innovative and come up with ideas how to manifest that intelligence in a way that it should be understood by the student. In other words, not just talking about what words to use, but how to engage the student. And a person who's not bar poel, is a malamed, that does not know, he's just a teacher, but he's not a teacher that has that skill of bar poel, of acting, of implementing. Even though his intelligence may be very superb, very very lofty, elevated, exalted. If he does not know how to consolidate his words, how to communicate his words, he will not affect the student. And as the student grows older, yes, as he grows older, he does need a better teacher, a greater teacher, but also someone who's a bar poel, who can communicate with him. He's basically saying, so just growing older, every yeshiva should know this, because very often in the yeshiva system, you have a better teacher, smarter, but he's not necessarily more applied. And all this is the tirda, the effort, the exertion, the immersion, the commitment, the involvement, the application of the transmitter, the mashpia, in the way, in knowing how, the advice, the counsel, the strategy how to transmit. Now he's going now to the change. So now he's going now to the change. And it's understood that this type of transmission itself is also changed by this process. It's not just, it's doing it for the student. What is that? Saying? Because that's the difference between a bar poil, the action person, and someone that's not bar poil, melamed bar poil. The one who's not a bar poil knows how to mashpia saseichel k'meishahu etzlei. He's mashpia. He transmits the seichel the way it's by him. And it's not commensurate and proportionate to the recipient. But the bar poil, on the other hand, he changes the transmission to tailor it, that it should be accordingly commensurate to the recipient. And in general, this is the seichel that shayach. This is intelligence that's already fitting for the recipient, because you're not talking about the seichel that's on the teacher on his own may not be appropriate to give to the students. As we know that in every inyan sichel, every intelligent idea, it has how the seichel is to l'atzmei, is to him, to the person himself. Shehu apnimius. That's the inner dimension of the seichel. And the outer dimension of the intelligence is shaykh, is relevant to the recipient. And this is where this Melamed Bar Poel has to, that's where his skill is, his art, is to make sure to change the hashpah, to transform the transmission should be commensurate to the recipient. It's not shinei mahus. He's not changing it from like intelligence to water. It's mamish. He's also not changing the idea. It's the same seichel. He's not changing the idea to a different idea. It's just a different paradigm, a different idiom. Because it's the same seichel mamish. The only thing, it's now coming in a more diminished way, and manifest in ideas that are commensurate to the recipient. Sometimes it'll also come in a different image. Because that's the way, that's only that way can the recipient receive. So we find from all of this that besides the fact that the mashpia, the transmitter, is busy and involved in the essential transmission to transmit the intelligence, in addition to that, he's also busy in making sure that it's commensurate to the student. He's always thinking about, in other words, he's not just busy transmitting, because even the first brilliant guy is also busy transmitting. He's also committed. He's speaking, he's explaining, but he's explaining on his terms. This one is also doing two things at once. Besides explaining an idea, he's thinking about his recipients and how they should, and how they're getting it. Is it fitting into their containers? And all this is because, as he said, the muchus ha'ara. It's not just light that's aloof, detached. It's because the essence of the reflection is transmitted within this. That's why the one who's transmitting is involved in it. Is more than that. He's confined in it. He's grasped in it. He's contained in it. Because he has to transmit it. Should he be like a sun and he just comes to the table and sits there and the light just comes from him, he doesn't have to do anything. Just give you an example.
Oh, the sun.
If he was like the sunlight, yeah.
I
If he was,
thought you said the sun out of
no, I meant S-U-N.
Oh.
If he was like a sun, so there's a logic here. His involvement in it is because you're committed, because you're transmitting something. Well, if and because this hope, the transmission is in order to affect this recipient, that it should be within him. It should manifest internally. You want the student to integrate and internalize it. That's why he has to be this type of effort, exertion, and hisaskus, real involvement. How the shefa, the transmission, should be received well. And also the transmission changes in this in order for it to become commensurate to the student. The Mittler Rebbe was being Yechidus, and people would come to him, as you know, after every Yechidus he had to change his undershirt because he was soaked because of this. So there is hashpah that comes, mamay lamata, light, but then there's involvement. When someone came to a Rebbe, Yechidus was an involvement. It wasn't just I'm giving you good advice because I'm a smart guy. The Mittler Rebbe said he had to find it within himself. I mean, this is real hashpah. So that's why I said to you, the examples he gives are good examples if you think about the real thing. Where, for example, of course when a Rebbe gave an order, he gave it a lot of thought and he didn't just tell people go and mitzvot film. But is he sitting there right now and immersing himself with you in your situation in every detail? No. So it's not that the order is less important or less vital. It has within it plenty. But begilui, like you said, behelam, you can have tremendous amount of seichel and midas in it. But begilui, what are you right now? The investment right now, that's the key thing here. So all this is coming to explain another form of transmission as opposed to Ohr. So let's do the summary now. And
even the sun, S-U-N, is completely emotional. It doesn't matter if it really is science.
He's going to go back. This is pages now. He's going to explain the sun, and then he's going to explain Keiches the Nefesh. Is the Nefesh an example? There are many, many examples. Each example adds something, another one's not. Perfect example you're not going to find.
But it's only an example. It's because the sun really isn't that thing. I mean, it's merely a mushroom.
But it's a major muscle in Chassidus, so I would not diminish it so quickly.
But it doesn't have to be always like that. That's the thing that was bothering a lot of people. Even you yourself.
Have to?
You were talking about the scientists show different things and this and that. Just a muscle, so it doesn't have to.
But I don't like when you say just a muscle, because it's a muscle from a Rebbe, which means it's just as good as the nimshal. So it's more than just a muscle. Yeah, it's also part of Torah. So I wouldn't just. You're making it. Let me put it this way: first struggle and understand the muscle before you start looking for the exceptions. The muscle is a reason there's a muscle, because the muscle has a lot of.
Clarify a little with that.
No, but I want to just tell you the other way around. You don't. The muscle has a lot of wisdom in it, and even if you'll find it, but I would not begin by finding how the muscle doesn't work. I'd first find how the muscle does work before you work on how it doesn't work.
Obviously, how it works in most of the cases.
Not always. Sometimes you need to really understand, because the muscle is the reason he's giving a muscle is because he himself involved Shefa to give us a way to understand. The muscle is helping us understand. Now, obviously, once you exhaust the muscle, there comes a point where you start seeing. But I think the way to approach it is let's understand the muscle. If we have a question, we ask. Then, of course, at the end of the day, every muscle is going to have its limits. But I believe in the next chapters he's going to discuss about all the limits of these mashalim too. Remember, he hasn't even gone to Ohr yet in the real way. This is all still more or less examples. Mistakenly, I thought that the boy here he was starting to go, but he was beginning to go there. I mean, he's going back in an interesting way. He's moving backwards. He started with the Zrika, and now he moved back to Seichel, and that Seichel is now the real example of Shefa. But he wanted, I guess, use examples that were more like on a lower level and move your way up. Because Seichel ends up being the excellent, best example. I understand the Seichel example a lot more than the stone. Not that of course, because the energy in the stone, it takes a little abstraction. Here, you're clearly a teacher and a student, so it's clear what's going on. There's an involvement, there's a transmission of ideas, the ideas remain there. But nevertheless, so to ask a question you could ask is, why did he bring the stone example? And not he didn't bring it as a line. He's bringing it and goes back to it again and again, 3 times maybe. So clearly the stone has something to add here, which I have not yet, have to figure it out. I think the stone example is very much for Yesh Ma'ayin. That's where the stone is very important. Huh?
Such a tremendous example for it.
Yeah. Whereas Seichel is not really Yesh Ma'ayin, because it's like the giving birth to a child is Yesh Ma'ayin, which he brought. Because there you're like giving an atzmis.
Yeah.
Now, the stone is also not a because you're not recreating the stone. But you're making a stone that's the stationary move. Yeah, right. No, so I'm saying there's no question when you dissect it, you're going to find in each mushal something that another part of the mushal doesn't have. I wouldn't even go there until I hear the whole nimshal. Once you hear the end of it, then you can go back and say, because you could see that he's planting in every line here. You see words. It's very, very clear that when you start talking how it is in Ohr and Shefa above, all this is going to come alive. Because this is all like examples.
I didn't hear the nimshal because everything.
You could see how, because I could keep saying about the two things, for example, from the perspective of the transmitter and the transmission itself.
Even what we call a nimshal is really probably a marshal when he's dealing.
For sure. By the way, that's the whole idea. It says Torah is mashal hakadmaini, the primordial example. Everything is. That's why I wanted to say to you, be careful with example, because example is not an external. Example itself,
right. Existence
is an example to understand God. So the only qualification.
Anyway, so.
I know, but you want to have the qualification is like the Rebbe says with Ohr, an interesting footnote. The Rebbe has a Chelik Zayin Kudzichas. The fact that from spiritual comes to physical, right there are because physical has time and space. Like for example, it takes 8 seconds for the sunlight to reach us from the sun. So that right there, that example doesn't work in Lamaila. There's no span of time. It's automatic. Here, you block the sun, you're going to have 8 more seconds of sunlight. Because it's because you're not seeing what happened. Not because the sun remained out, because the sun travels. Light travels. But
that's why we can see what happened millions of years ago by looking at a distant galaxy.
Let's do the kitzur. V'yesed yuvan mislapshus haseichel, and we'll understand this. Even we see this chapter added the whole thing with seichel. Till now, the chapter before was koiches, was faculties. The faculty of throwing, the faculty of art. There's a faculty. This chapter was the focus of intelligence, and he moved his way up. He started with intelligence, the minimal intelligence in throwing a stone, moved his way to the intelligence within art, gave the example above how Chachma God creates first with wisdom and the things he creates with emotions and so on, and then went over to understand it all with the example of a person who commands, a person who speaks with love, and goes all the way to speaking with seichel.
And it's interesting. He moved from the psychological, spiritual to the physical. Now he went from the psychological, spiritual to the spiritual. He stayed on the same level.
Yeah.
That's how he starts out the beginning of the parak. In other words, he went from seichel to stone. Now he's going to seichel to Noah, seichel to painting.
Correct.
Seichel to tone.
Correct. And we increasingly understood what will be understood. The whole idea of shefa, of transmission, that is a transmission of substance that requires a commitment and creates a change in the situation. A relationship, shefa's relationship, mislapshus haseichel. We'll increasingly understand it through the manifestation of seichel intelligence. In the craft of drawing, art, it's more revealed and more manifest than in throwing. Ulamaila, and what is that above? That's the 10 things that God created. There are things that primarily come from Chachma Bina Das, or primarily come from the level of Chachma Chesed Gvura Tiferes.
The 10 things that were created, or 10 things used in creation?
Used.
So he's talking about the Sefer Midas.
Essentially, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. He actually uses this here. He didn't say it specifically. The essential creation is like throwing. I mentioned it because it was clear to me that's the reference. In other words, it's like this. The example he gave was that there are differences of how much we invest our seichel, right? So in throwing, much less investment and much less revealed. Then, for example, when we art, right? So the same thing is when God created the world. Remember, I mentioned the beauty of the universe. You have more involvement. That's more like art, and like the general creation itself is more like throwing, because it doesn't.
Continually throwing every rega.
Yeah.
That's what the seichel breaks out.
I said the example like a stone that doesn't seem to have a lot of beauty in it, will not reflect as much, is not revealing as much, let's say, art. But he's saying here, and explain an example for this.
I'm not sure what your question is, because the Sefer over here points out, says Rika itself, so it doesn't seem to be a Kiddush, but the Rebbe itself.
Yeah, but the truth is, I didn't notice that when you read it the first time, anyway, I didn't point that out. Now he says it clearly. He says, in the Pnim, he didn't say Hisavus is B'chinas Rika al derech Mo'ah. No, it was the example. He's actually just okay. Fine, it fits. You're right. Yeah, the Sefer Bar does say Zrika. Correct. So the question is, what's Zrika? What is the example for the throwing, and what's the example of the art? That's what I'm referring to. So what he said was that there's the distinctions of the different creatures where they come from Chabad or Chagas. That to me is like the difference between, let's say, art or the power of throwing, where there's less investment. So it all comes down to how much is revealed in creation, depending on where they come from. But what he's adding, what's clearly the Zrika in general, the example of throwing is on the entire Shabbos. Because he says that, what does the Sefer Rabbi? It says,
not to throw, it's a drop.
That's the Koyach HaGvul. Yeah, correct. Bottom line, it is Zrika, that the Koyach HaGvul, Shebo B'chinas Yislapshus Be'elm, is like Shu Be'elm. Remember also here, the Zarkan he brings after the Gemara Chagiga. There it's before. Okay? Here, before, in the actual chapter, first he brings the Poyer, says that's the Koyach HaGvul, and that's Yislapshus, it's a Be'elm, like, as if when you throw something. Right? Then he comes to the Gemara and speaks about the different levels. Yeah. So bottom line is that the Boyer teaches us the wisdom within the throwing is very concealed. That's the bottom line. Then comes the actual specific. Then comes the specific 10 items, and that's already so-called how we manifest, like you do it through art, so to speak. Okay. He explained an example on this. The example, he doesn't say the example in the summary. The example is the difference between a command and love. The same things with transmission of intelligence, that you transmit the essence of the reflection. That's why it causes a change in the transmitter, but in adding or subtracting. And he's defined by it, he's limited in it, he's confined in it, and he's involved in it. In the transmission. Because, see, he says, the air pnimi, in other words. Because it's in order to affect in an internal, integrated way, therefore he has to get involved, he has to commit himself and struggle. How to transmit. Those are the knowing, the wise, advisory kidneys. And through this also the hashpah changes, as he explained, because it has to fit and be tailored to the student. Okay, so we did chapter 54, pages 96 through 98, Discourse 14, and Ayin Beis.